The year was 1760, and the air above England thickened with the first smoke of progress. Steam hissed from new engines, wheels turned faster than wind or muscle ever could, and the earth itself began to tremble under the weight of invention. The Industrial Revolution was not born from one idea but from hunger, a hunger for speed, control, and profit. Across the British Isles, machines replaced men, and for the first time in history, time itself became a currency measured in rotations per minute. In this new world, every hand mattered, even the smallest ones. When the old farmlands emptied after the agricultural revolution, thousands of rural families found themselves adrift. Mechanized ploughs and enclosed estates expelled peasants from their ancestral soil. The fields that once fed them now belonged to landlords and investors. They drifted toward the cities, to Manchester, Birmingham, and Leeds, where chimneys pierced the grey sky and factory bells replaced church bells. For many, the promise was simple. Work meant survival. But work in this new age demanded bodies that could bend into crawl spaces, twist under machines, and cost almost nothing to replace. Children fit perfectly into the gears of progress. The earliest factories, called mills, devoured laborers by the hundreds. Textile magnates like Richard Arkwright and Samuel Gregg built empires of cotton that never slept. Their spinning frames clattered through the night, powered by rivers at first and later by steam. The machines were enormous, loud, and hungry. To keep them moving, overseers recruited orphans from parish workhouses. Contracts were signed not by the children but by the parishes that wanted to be rid of them. They were marched in groups, some as young as 7, to remote mills in the north where they would live in crowded dormitories and rise before dawn to tend machines larger than their bodies. Inside, the air was a storm of lint and oil. The children's lungs filled with dust, their fingers, prized for their smallness, mended snapped threads while the machines still turned. Accidents were constant. A misstep could mean a hand torn away or a scalp ripped off by an exposed spindle. There were no inspectors, no laws, and no mercy. Industrialists claimed they were providing opportunity and discipline. They said labor taught morality. What it truly taught was silence. Coal mines were worse. Deep beneath the surface, boys and girls worked as trappers and drawers. The trappers sat alone in darkness for 12-hour shifts, opening and closing wooden doors to let carts pass. Their only light came from the candle of a passing miner. The drawers, crawling on hands and knees, hauled heavy wagons of coal through tunnels so narrow they could barely lift their heads. When ventilation failed, they coughed until they bled. When explosions came, no one knew how many died. Records were rarely kept. Coal was more valuable than truth. By the early 1800s, the system had become self-sustaining. Factories and mines competed for cheaper, smaller workers. Wages for adults fell because children could be made to do the same work for a fraction of the cost. The wealthy industrialists grew richer, while entire generations of the poor remained trapped in a cycle that called exploitation necessity. Cities swelled with tenements where families slept 8 to a room. Diseases like cholera and typhus thrived in the damp alleys that smelled of soot and despair. Yet politicians praised the age of progress. Britain's economy soared, railways, bridges, and ironworks testified to national glory. Few asked who paid for it in blood. The cruelty was not hidden. Visitors from abroad, including reformers and writers, documented what they saw. In 1832, the physician Michael Sadler presented evidence to Parliament describing children falling asleep at their frames, beaten awake by overseers. In one testimony, a girl of 10 described being strapped to keep her upright when exhaustion made her collapse. Another, a boy of 8, said he had not seen the morning sun in months. The stories were horrific, yet to many factory owners, they were simply part of business. The moral equation of the Industrial Revolution was clear. If progress demanded suffering, then suffering became virtue. Technology accelerated, and with it, greed evolved. Steam engines roared louder, machines grew more complex, and production became a national obsession. Competition was war. Every second lost meant money lost. The relentless pursuit of efficiency stripped away the last remnants of humanity from industrial labor. Children became invisible, their value reduced to movement and endurance. The more they endured, the more they were demanded. In some factories they worked 24-hour shifts, alternating between day and night with no concept of time. Bells signaled when to wake, when to eat, and when to return to the noise. Childhood vanished into routine. There were moments of defiance, small and easily crushed. Mothers begged overseers to spare their sick children, only to be told another family waited to take their place. Runaways were hunted, returned, and beaten as examples. The system depended on fear as much as poverty. It produced not only goods but obedience. In its logic, the child worker was perfect, fast, cheap, and too young to rebel. Across the Channel, France, Germany, and the United States followed the same path. Industrialization spread like a contagion, carrying its methods and its victims with it. In France's silk factories and America's cotton mills, the pattern repeated with long hours, low wages, and ruined bodies. By the 1840s, an entire generation of European and American children had grown up knowing nothing but labor. Their laughter had been replaced by the rhythm of machinery, their games by the repetition of survival. The paradox of the Industrial Revolution emerged clearly. A century celebrated for invention was also an age of dehumanization. The steam engine, the spinning jenny, the power loom, each breakthrough that pushed civilization forward also deepened the suffering of those who powered it. Progress was measured in profit, not in compassion. The same newspapers that praised the marvels of engineering ignored the funerals of 12-year-olds who died at the looms. By mid-century, the wealth gap yawned wider than ever before. Aristocrats and factory barons built estates from the sweat of children who owned nothing. The moral blindness was staggering. Churches preached gratitude, governments preached order, and newspapers preached pride in the empire's productivity. The truth was buried beneath layers of soot and justification. Yet even in the darkest mills something flickered, a realization that this could not last forever. Reformers began to gather evidence, artists began to paint the pain, and writers began to describe what they saw. But that awakening belonged to another chapter. For now, in this first act of the Industrial Revolution, greed ruled without shame. The machine was hungry, the factories endless, and the children, the smallest, weakest, most desperate, became its first fuel. Factories multiplied until their walls became the new horizon. Cities that had once ended in fields now ended in smoke. The air turned grey, thick, and bitter, and the skyline of the 19th century became a forest of chimneys that never slept. This was the empire of smoke, the visible mark of the Industrial Revolution's triumph and its tragedy. Every morning, thousands of workers poured into the factories as though entering temples of iron, but what they worshipped was not faith, it was survival. Within those walls, the world had changed. The promise of progress that had begun with invention had turned into an empire of labor built on exhaustion. Inside, the air was suffocating. Cotton fibers floated through every beam of light. The sound of looms and spinning frames drowned out voices. The floor shook beneath the weight of machines, and the children who worked among them learned to move like shadows, fast and quiet, because one distraction could mean death. They worked 14, sometimes 16 hours a day. The smaller children crawled under machines to clean moving gears, their bodies slick with oil and sweat. The older ones hauled baskets of thread or pushed carts of coal through narrow corridors. Their hands hardened early, their backs bent too soon, and by the time most reached adulthood, they were already broken by it. Factory owners claimed discipline built character. They hung banners with words like industry, morality, and obedience, but in truth, hunger built obedience, not virtue. Parents sent their children because a child's wage, though small, could mean the difference between eating and starving. The system fed itself on desperation. It was said that the factory bell ruled more lives than the church bell, and for those inside, time belonged not to them but to the machines. The first ring called them to work before sunrise, the next marked the short pause for bread, and the last released them into the dark streets long after sunset. Outside, the city grew around this rhythm. Streets filled with ash, alleys filled with noise, and rivers turned black with dye and runoff. Even nature began to obey the machine. Manchester, once described as green and peaceful, became a maze of mills and warehouses that coughed soot into the air until even daylight seemed grey. The smell of burning coal mixed with the sourness of sweat and wet fabric. People began to forget the colour of the sky. They lived under clouds that never moved. In winter, when the fog thickened, factory whistles sounded like cries through the mist, guiding the workers who could not see their own path home. Industrialists called it progress. To them, smoke meant success, proof that production was endless and profit was alive. But behind every brick of their prosperity were the hands of the poor. The empire of smoke did not build itself. It was carried on the shoulders of men, women, and children whose names were never recorded. Accidents became part of the daily routine. Steam pipes burst, gears caught hair and clothes, and the cries of pain vanished under the thunder of iron. If a child died, the machine paused only long enough to be cleaned before turning again. In this new world, morality bent under the weight of industry. Families who once worked together on farms were now separated inside the walls of mills. Fathers rarely saw their children. Mothers, if employed, left infants in crowded nurseries beside the factory floor, where the sound of crying mixed with the rhythm of looms. Childhood itself began to disappear. In place of laughter came the beat of pistons and the click of metal teeth. For the poor, life became a contract signed with fatigue. As the system expanded, so did its cruelty. New mills opened every month, their owners competing to produce more, faster, and cheaper. To lower costs, they demanded more hours from the same bodies. When exhaustion slowed the workers, fines were deducted from their wages. The weak were dismissed, the sick replaced by others more desperate. Children, too young to understand their own worth, became numbers in a ledger. Some were 9 years old and already expected to carry as much weight as grown men. In the mining towns, little girls worked beside boys, both blackened by coal dust, their lungs permanently scarred before they had even learned to write their names. The empire's logic was simple: productivity at any price. Reformers who questioned it were mocked as sentimental dreamers who did not understand economics. Yet outside the walls, visitors began to notice the contradiction. The cities of progress were also cities of ruin. While factory owners built mansions lined with marble and gaslight, their workers lived in damp tenements where disease moved faster than hope. Streets overflowed with sewage and children played in puddles of ash. Cholera became a companion of the industrial age. The same steam that powered wealth also spread death. Artists and writers tried to capture what statistics could not. Painters showed rows of exhausted faces, newspapers described the dense smog that dimmed even the noon sun, and poets compared the factories to furnaces of hell. The image of the Industrial Revolution split in two, one side bright with invention, the other black with despair. What no one could deny was that smoke had become the emblem of modernity. It rose above every city like a crown, dark and shimmering, a symbol of triumph and decay entwined. By the 1840s, this empire of smoke stretched across continents. Britain's model of production was copied in France, Belgium, and America. Cities that once envied Manchester now envied its pollution, seeing in it a sign of national strength. The same hunger for efficiency devoured humanity in every language. Railways carried coal to ports, ships carried machines abroad, and the cycle spread faster than reform could follow. For every law proposed to limit child labor or shorten workdays, new factories opened elsewhere without restraint. The Industrial Revolution was no longer a single event or place. It had become a living organism, expanding, breathing smoke into every corner of the modern world. It promised progress but delivered exhaustion. It celebrated invention but demanded obedience. Beneath its greatness lay a quiet truth. The cost of its glory was measured not in money or steel but in the human lives it consumed. The empire of smoke was not built by kings or engineers alone. It was built by millions who worked, coughed, and endured in its shadow, their tears and broken bones buried beneath the soot of history. By the mid-19th century, the rhythm of machinery had replaced the rhythm of childhood. In every factory town, the whistle at dawn summoned thousands of small bodies into corridors of heat, dust, and danger. What had begun as a promise of progress now produced a generation defined by scars. They called it work, but it was survival measured in blisters and broken bones. The youngest among them had forgotten what silence sounded like. Inside the mills, iron wheels spun faster each year. The need for speed erased caution. Overseers urged children to crawl beneath running frames to untangle threads and collect waste cotton. When their tiny hands hesitated, the belts did not stop. Fingers disappeared between rollers, hair wrapped around spindles, and screams dissolved into the constant thunder of the machines. Witnesses later described how a child could vanish beneath a loom and reappear a moment later limp and bleeding. The foreman would shout for the others to keep working while the floor was washed and the machines resumed. Time lost meant profit lost, and profit forgave nothing. Hospitals near the manufacturing centers filled with small patients, the way factories filled with smoke. Surgeons recorded crushed skulls, severed limbs, and burns from boiling dye. Some children arrived so covered in oil and soot that nurses had to scrub for hours before finding the wound. Many did not survive the night. In Leeds and Manchester, doctors began referring to a new set of illnesses: mill fever, spinner's lung, and the strange curvature of the spine caused by endless hours of stooping. In the mining towns, the ailments were worse. Boys who hauled coal carts through tunnels barely larger than their bodies developed twisted limbs and blackened lungs before they turned 12. The mines swallowed light as completely as they swallowed mercy. Deep below the surface, the smallest children sat alone in absolute darkness, opening and closing wooden doors to control the flow of air. They were called trappers. Their shift lasted 12 hours. Some sang to themselves to know they were still alive. When the doors jammed and air failed to move, explosions ripped through the tunnels. Survivors told of finding the bodies of playmates still clutching the ropes of the carts they had tried to save. Records of these disasters were brief, a single line in the company ledger marking property lost and production delayed. Coal remained more valuable than truth. Above-ground fires turned factories into ovens. The combination of oil, dry timber, and cotton dust made every mill a fuse waiting to ignite. In 1818, a blaze in Manchester consumed an entire building before sunrise. Locked doors prevented escape because owners feared theft during the night shift. Witnesses standing in the street heard pounding on windows that would not open. When the smoke cleared, 42 children were dead. The owners rebuilt within weeks, their profits barely dented. The incident earned 3 sentences in the local paper and a sermon on the virtue of diligence. For decades, the public accepted these deaths as part of industrial life. Progress demanded casualties, and the poor were its natural offering. But fragments of truth began to escape the walls. In 1832, the physician Michael Sadler gathered testimonies from child workers for Parliament. A 10-year-old girl described falling asleep at her frame only to be beaten awake with a leather strap. A boy of 8 spoke of seeing another child pulled into the machinery and told to finish his shift before crying. These accounts, printed and distributed across Britain, cracked the polished image of industrial pride. The moral empire of the factory began to tremble under the weight of its own witnesses. Images gave the stories faces. Early photographers entered the mills with their box cameras and long exposures, capturing motionless rows of children staring at the lens with eyes too old for their age. The soot on their skin looked like shadow, the exhaustion like defeat. One photograph from a London match factory showed girls whose jaws were eaten away by phosphorus fumes, their smiles replaced by open wounds. Another from a Glasgow textile mill revealed children so small they had to stand on boxes to reach their machines. These pictures, though rare, carried more power than words. They froze pain long enough for society to see it. In America, similar tragedies unfolded. In the cotton states and the coal towns of Pennsylvania, inspectors reported children as young as 6 tending spinning frames or picking slate from conveyor belts. When the photographer Lewis Hine published his series on child labor decades later, he called them the people no one knew existed. The transatlantic echo was unmistakable. The broken generation was not confined to one nation. It was the natural product of an age that measured worth by output and progress by smoke. The psychological wounds were harder to record but just as deep. Teachers in charity schools noticed that mill children could not concentrate for more than a few minutes, their nerves conditioned by noise and fear. Many stuttered or flinched at sudden movement. In crowded lodging houses, they dreamed of gears turning and woke screaming. The few who escaped the factories carried those sounds with them for life. Writers like Charles Dickens drew on these realities for his characters in Oliver Twist and Hard Times, turning private misery into public outrage. His stories were fiction, but the world he described was not. By the 1840s, Britain's wealth had doubled, yet so had its distance from compassion. Parliament debated production quotas while the cemeteries of industrial towns filled with unnamed graves. Church bells rang for prosperity while mothers buried their children in silence. Reformers like Lord Shaftesbury pleaded for change, arguing that a nation built on broken bodies could not call itself civilized. Their opponents warned that regulation would destroy trade. To them, the children were not victims but necessary tools in the great machine of empire. What made this generation truly broken was not only what they endured but how completely their suffering was ignored. They were born, worked, and died inside the rhythm of progress without ever touching the benefits it promised. Their stories reached newspapers only when someone from the outside forced the world to look. Even then, the outrage faded quickly beneath new reports of inventions and profits. For every reform proposed, there was another fire, another collapse, another name missing from the morning roll call. By the end of the century, the factories still roared and the mines still breathed smoke, but the first cracks of conscience had appeared. Inspectors began to count not only products but people. Laws slowly limited hours, required schooling, and banned the youngest from the mines. Yet the reform came too late for the generation already lost. They had carried the Industrial Revolution on their small shoulders and paid for it with their health, their limbs, and their lives. Their legacy was not invention but warning. Progress without humanity devours its own future. The empire of industry had forged wealth beyond imagination, but in its shadow lay the broken generation, a testament to how far a society will go when it forgets the value of a single child. The air of the factories began to change, not with the smell of progress but with the first faint breath of defiance. After decades of silence, the whispers started inside the walls that had swallowed generations. A mother's cry when her child failed to return from the night shift became an accusation that refused to fade. A journalist's pen, once focused on trade and invention, began to describe the shadows behind prosperity. Pain, once hidden in soot and routine, started to take shape in words. The empire of smoke, built on fear and obedience, did not yet know it, but its foundations had begun to tremble. The change did not come suddenly. It began with stories passed between families, with workers gathering at taverns and churchyards to share what they had seen. Mothers spoke of children crippled before puberty, of coffins too small for their occupants. Fathers who had once accepted the system as unchangeable began to question why machines deserved rest when their children did not. Across industrial towns, whispers turned into discussions, and discussions became petitions. The poor, long blamed for their own misery, began to demand explanation rather than forgiveness. For the first time, they dared to imagine that the suffering inside the mills was not destiny but design. Writers carried those whispers beyond the factory gates. The growing power of the press transformed outrage into weaponry. Charles Dickens, Elizabeth Gaskell, and the poet Ebenezer Eliot wrote not of kings and heroes but of the anonymous souls who greased the gears of empire. Their words reached parlors, libraries, and political offices. The comfortable classes, accustomed to speaking of progress as an abstract good, began to see its victims in print. It was one thing to praise industry in theory and another to picture a child coughing blood beneath a loom. Conscience, long dormant, began to stir in the hearts of readers who had never set foot in a mill. The movement found champions inside Parliament as well. One of them was Lord Ashley, later known as the Earl of Shaftesbury, whose compassion for factory children became an obsession. He visited the mills himself, descending into basements thick with dust, where boys and girls barely able to stand worked beside roaring engines. What he saw haunted him for life. When he brought his testimony before Parliament, his voice cracked as he described a girl of 9 whose spine had twisted from years of lifting heavy bobbins. His opponents dismissed him as sentimental, claiming poverty would worsen if labor was restricted. He answered that a nation could survive less cotton but not less humanity. In 1833, the first Factory Act passed. It was imperfect, fragile, and widely ignored, yet it marked the first time the state admitted that industry required boundaries. Children under 9 were banned from textile mills, and those under 13 were limited to 9 hours a day. Inspectors were appointed to enforce the law, though their numbers were few. When they entered the factories, owners met them with hostility, locking doors or hiding underage workers in storage rooms until the inspection ended. But even a single report, printed in an official document, pierced the armor of denial. The government had acknowledged that something was wrong. The rebellion of words soon spread underground to the mines. In 1842, after another commission gathered testimonies from miners, the public learned what had long been hidden below the surface. The report revealed that girls and boys worked naked beside grown men in tunnels too narrow for decency or dignity. It told of children chained to coal carts, crawling through mud and darkness for miles each day. The revelations shocked the country. Preachers read the findings aloud in churches, and the Queen herself expressed disgust. Within months, the Mines Act of 1842 was passed, banning women and children under 10 from working underground. It was another small victory, but it carried immense moral weight. Still, change was uneven. Many owners found loopholes or bribed inspectors, insisting that families would starve without the income of their children. They used religion to justify greed, claiming that work built discipline and prevented sin. But the tide of awareness could no longer be turned. As education reformers opened Sunday schools and reading rooms for workers, the idea of learning began to replace the inevitability of labor. Children who once saw the factory as their entire world began to dream of classrooms. The sound of pages turning joined, faintly but unmistakably, the rhythm of machinery. By the 1850s, the whispers of revolt had reached every layer of society. Newspapers printed editorials condemning factory cruelty. Photographers continued to capture evidence, freezing moments that no politician could explain away. Painters depicted pale faces glowing in the furnace light, not as symbols of progress but as accusations. The arts became a courtroom in which the Industrial Revolution itself was on trial. Even the church, which had long praised work as divine duty, began to preach compassion over profit. The same pulpits that once told workers to obey now urged the powerful to repent. In the cities, labor unions began to form among adults inspired by the plight of their children. Men who had once been silent out of fear learned to organize. They demanded shorter hours, safer conditions, and education for the next generation. Strikes spread from one town to another. Though often crushed by police, each one left an echo that refused to fade. The machine still roared, but beneath its noise a new rhythm grew, a rhythm of unity. The idea that human beings could stand together against the tyranny of production was revolutionary in itself. This awakening did not dismantle the empire of smoke overnight, but it changed the way people saw its foundations. The image of industry as pure progress shattered, replaced by a more complicated truth that innovation without conscience was another form of slavery. Reformers learned to use numbers and emotion together, producing reports that listed not only profits but casualties. The language of progress began to include the word responsibility. The child workers, once invisible, had become symbols of a nation's moral test. Each new law, each pamphlet, each protest drew from their suffering. Many of those children never lived to see the reforms that bore their names, but their pain reshaped the conscience of an age. When truth finally spread beyond the mills, the machine itself began to tremble. The rebellion was not an explosion but a steady rising of voices, a collective refusal to remain silent. It was not merely revolt, it was rebirth. In the smoke of the factories that had stolen so many lives, a new idea glowed like an ember, that progress could serve people rather than consume them. From that ember would grow the first real vision of social justice and the realization that the strength of a nation lay not in its machines but in the humanity of its children. The fight for reform began not with speeches but with exhaustion. For decades the working poor had whispered for mercy, and now they began to demand justice. The outcry that started as a plea in pamphlets grew into a storm of confrontation. Parliament, churches, and streets all echoed with one question. How much longer could a nation call itself civilized while its children labored in misery? The age of invention was now being judged by the conscience it had ignored. Industrialists reacted first. They gathered in private clubs and trade halls to defend their empire. Without child labor, they argued, the economy would collapse. The mills would slow, the mines would empty, and prices would rise. They claimed reformers were dreamers who had never balanced a ledger or smelled coal dust. To them, the suffering of children was unfortunate but necessary, a sacrifice to keep the engines of empire turning. Their newspapers printed columns warning that restrictions on labor would lead to unemployment and famine. Greed disguised itself as logic, and progress once again became an excuse for cruelty. But outside the boardrooms, a new force grew louder. Journalists began to document the hidden cost of prosperity. In illustrated papers and cheap broadsheets, the public saw for the first time the images of small, pale faces covered in grime, of children with bandaged stumps instead of hands. Priests preached against the sin of indifference. Teachers demanded that education, not endurance, should define childhood. Mothers, who had buried too many sons and daughters, formed groups that petitioned the government and organized vigils outside factories. Their cries broke through the walls of silence that profit had built. Parliament became a battlefield of arguments and conscience. Reformers like Lord Shaftesbury and Richard Osler stood before their peers with evidence gathered from inspectors, doctors, and priests. They spoke of girls collapsing from exhaustion, of boys who went blind from years spent in darkness, of children whose only reward for obedience was death before adulthood. Their opponents countered with figures and forecasts, insisting that progress could not afford compassion. The debate stretched for years. In one session, a member of Parliament held up a tiny boot found in the ruins of a burned factory and asked if this was the price of progress. The chamber fell silent, and the boot became a symbol of the moral reckoning now underway. Outside those walls, the struggle was far less polite. In several cities, riots erupted when workers demanded shorter hours and safer conditions. Police forces, often hired by the same men who owned the mills, beat demonstrators in the streets. But repression only fueled the fire. In London, Leeds, and Glasgow, crowds gathered around speakers who shouted that childhood was not a commodity. The growing labour movement began to link the rights of children to the rights of all workers. Their chants carried through alleyways thick with soot, a human sound cutting through the roar of machinery. The press magnified these moments, turning protest into public theatre. Articles detailed every confrontation, and readers who had once ignored the issue now followed it as passionately as they followed wars abroad. Letters flooded Parliament from priests, teachers, and doctors demanding reform. Foreign visitors described Britain as a land of great machines and broken people, a kingdom rich in invention but poor in mercy. No empire could withstand that kind of scrutiny forever. Slowly, painfully, reform advanced. New laws appeared, each one a small victory carved from resistance. The 10 Hours Act limited the workday for women and young people. Later, the Factory Acts of the 1850s and 1860s expanded those protections, requiring safety guards on machines and regular inspections. Schools were built beside mills so that children could learn at least a few hours each day. Each measure was greeted by outrage from industrialists who predicted economic ruin, yet the mills kept spinning and the nation did not collapse. The lie that greed was indispensable began to fade. Still, reform came at a cost. Inspectors sent to enforce the new laws faced hostility and even violence. Some were chased from factories, others bribed to look away. In many rural towns the changes were ignored, and children continued to work long hours under false names. Progress moved at the pace of bureaucracy while suffering moved at the pace of need. Yet the balance had shifted. The idea that childhood deserved protection had entered public thought, and once it existed, it could not be erased. By the 1870s Education Acts spread across the country, declaring that every child had the right to learn. Factories began to adapt, relying on machines and adult labor rather than endless rows of children. Some owners, sensing the change of tide, rebranded themselves as philanthropists, building schools and housing for workers to repair their reputations. Others resisted until the very end, but the culture around them no longer celebrated their wealth as virtue. Newspapers now praised compassion as progress and condemned cruelty as weakness. The industrial age was learning a new language, one that combined production with conscience. The battle for childhood was not won in a single law or year. It was won through exhaustion, through persistence, through the bravery of those who refused to look away. Teachers who opened classrooms in factory towns, priests who spoke of morality instead of obedience, journalists who published the photographs that embarrassed a nation, and mothers who carried the memory of their lost children into the public square all forced change to happen. Their courage turned compassion into policy. By the end of the century, the sight of children working in factories had become a reminder of shame rather than pride. The same society that once justified their exploitation now called it barbaric. What began as whispers of revolt had become a national conscience. The machine still turned, but for the first time it did so under watchful eyes. The reformers had proven that progress without mercy was no progress at all. The freedom of children had not been granted by kindness but earned through confrontation. Every law carried the weight of those who suffered before it. Every rite carried the memory of those who had none. The war for childhood had been fought in silence, in poverty, and in courage, and though it ended slowly, it ended decisively. Justice had been won not through mercy but through the will to face the truth, and the world that emerged from that struggle could never again pretend it did not know the cost of innocence lost. By the dawn of the 20th century, the sound of factory bells still echoed, but a quieter force had begun to shape the modern world. Child labor, once the invisible engine of progress, had started to fade in Britain. The laws of reform, fought for over generations, were finally working. Inspectors now entered mills without fear, schools stood where sweatshop once operated, and a new idea of childhood was slowly being born. The same society that had once sacrificed its children to the machine now celebrated them as the promise of a better tomorrow. But history rarely ends with victory. The system did not die. It simply changed its address. As Britain cleaned its conscience, its industries expanded overseas. The same men who had built fortunes on child labor began building factories in colonies and developing nations where laws were weaker and desperation stronger. The empire that had exported textiles now exported its methods. In India, Egypt, and parts of Africa, children toiled in cotton fields and spinning rooms that looked eerily similar to the ones once condemned in Manchester. The language of exploitation changed from English to global economics, but the rhythm of suffering stayed the same. Progress had not healed the wound. It had learned to hide it better. Industrialization spread across the Atlantic as well. In the growing cities of America, child labor returned in new forms. Immigrant families arriving from Europe found themselves caught in the same trap that Britain had only just escaped. 10-year-old boys crawled beneath machines in textile mills in Massachusetts. Barefoot girls worked long nights in tobacco factories in Virginia. Newsboys filled the streets of New York before dawn, shouting headlines about prosperity they would never share. The reform that Britain claimed as a moral victory had not stopped the machine. It had only sent its hum farther away. By the early 20th century, global trade linked factories across continents. The cost of goods fell while the cost of life remained invisible. Consumers in London and Paris bought cheap clothing, unaware that the stitches were made by children in Calcutta or Shanghai. Each purchase whispered a quiet truth: the world had not abolished child labor, it had outsourced it. The Industrial Revolution, once confined to coal and steam, had become an international cycle of exploitation. Nations congratulated themselves for progress at home while turning their backs on the misery that sustained their wealth abroad. The 20th century brought new versions of the same pattern. When machines replaced children in factories, children were sent to mines. When mines closed, they were sent to plantations. When plantations mechanized, they filled workshops assembling products for distant markets. Governments passed new declarations and conventions, but paper cannot silence hunger. Where poverty exists, the factory always finds a way to reopen its doors. The faces change, the accents change, but the story remains identical. A small pair of hands, a promise of wages, and a life traded for survival. By the 21st century, humanity could no longer claim ignorance. Photographs from Bangladesh, Vietnam, and parts of Africa began to mirror those from Victorian England. Children worked in textile mills, brick kilns, and cobalt mines that supplied the batteries of modern devices. They inhaled dust instead of smoke, but their silence sounded the same. Corporations called it supply chain labor, a phrase that stripped suffering of identity. Activists called it what it was, the continuation of an old sin wearing a modern face. The revolution that once transformed the world had left behind a ghost, and that ghost still lived in the hands of millions of working children. This new global age prided itself on humanitarian progress, yet it built its wealth on the same equation as before: cheap labor equals profit, and the cheapest labor remains that of the powerless. In the 19th century, factories justified exploitation in the name of national prosperity. In the 21st, companies justify it in the name of global growth. The vocabulary of greed has evolved, but its logic has not. The same excuses echo through time. Without child labor, they say, production will slow. Without production, economies will collapse. Without obedience, there will be chaos. And once again, humanity convinces itself that the suffering of a few is the price of comfort for the many. Yet there are lessons carved into the ashes of the Industrial Revolution. The reformers who once stood against the mills proved that laws could change and that conscience could challenge profit. Their victories remind the modern world that exploitation is not inevitable, that every generation can choose whether to ignore or confront injustice. The story of child labor is not a history of progress but a history of persistence. Each act of exposure, each reform, each photograph that forces the world to see the truth is a continuation of that battle for childhood. Still, the lesson remains incomplete. Technology has made the world faster but not fairer. The same systems that once demanded children to spin cotton now rely on them to mine minerals, assemble electronics, and harvest crops. Progress has changed its tools, not its heart. A society that boasts of innovation while allowing exploitation has not evolved. It has only grown more sophisticated in its denial. The children of the 21st century do not work beneath steam engines, but their lives still feed the engines of profit. The moral legacy of the Industrial Revolution is a mirror, and what we see in it depends on how deeply we are willing to look. When we study the photographs of soot-covered boys beside furnaces or the testimonies of factory girls who lost their sight to dim light, we do not just see history. We see a reflection of the present. Every modern convenience carries a trace of that same past, the echo of a promise that progress would be humane and the reality that it rarely is. We like to believe we ended child labor. In truth, we moved it out of sight. We replaced the sound of looms with the hum of machines oceans away. We erased the faces of those who build what we consume. The comfort of distance replaced the discomfort of guilt. But the numbers remain. Millions of children still work in conditions that mirror those once condemned in Britain 2 centuries ago. The empire of smoke became an empire of silence, global and invisible. History's judgment is clear. Progress without ethics is not civilization but repetition. The Industrial Revolution gave humanity the power to shape its world, and with that power came the responsibility to protect those who build it. The question left behind is not whether we have advanced, but whether we have learned. The children who built the factories of the 19th century shaped the modern age. The children who labor today shape the future we will one day inherit. We did not end child labor. We exported it, rebranded it, and learned to live comfortably beside it. The mirror remains, waiting for the courage to face it.